Good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to this webinar organized by Caritas Internationalis, Kiev, SIDSE, and Laudato Si movement. This event, we will focus on a faith leader statement on loss and damage, which was developed by the organizer along with other partners. But today, since there's an upcoming COP28 starting on November 30th, there will be also an occasion to discuss and reflect together in view of this important event. The Faith Leader Statement on Loss and Damage was produced following of an event on the issue which took place on last June, and there was a discussion between different experts and people, both government representatives and civil society people, with lived experience on loss and damage. After this dialogue, which included a mix of technical input and recommendation with both theological and moral reflection, there was a rich body of thought, which was that condensed in this statement. This document asks for a fit-for-purpose loss and damage fund and define 5 crucial principles that this fund must uphold to secure climate justice and accelerate assistance to those affected by climate impact in different ways. These principles encompass accessibility, comprehensiveness, restorativeness, representativeness, efficiency, and effectiveness. Since, as we know, and also as the Holy Father remembered that in Laudato Deum, COP28 is an important event and bears responsibilities of reaching consensus on the creation of a loss and damage fund. Our voice has to be heard during this important event, and that will be made possible also through this statement and all the support that this statement is getting. And we are very pleased to inform you today that we have secured a slot on December 1st in the Faith Pavilion at COP28. There will be an ending event which will be hosted. And during this gathering, the statement, the Faith Leader Statement, will be delivered to the COP28 presidency. This statement so far, as we were saying, has really gathered a lot of support. There were more than 640 people sign it, coming from 58 different countries from every continent. And among the people who signed this statement, there are important faith leaders, cardinals, archbishops, bishops, also nearly 200 sisters, but also people from other faiths. And one other element we would like to stress is that remarkably, 84% of those endorsing the statement are coming from the global north. So, before giving the floor to the organizer and the panelists, I just would like to inform you that at the end of all the presentation, there will be a space for question and answer, and you are kindly requested to submit your question through the chat box. Now, I'm very pleased to give the floor to the representatives from two of the two organizations organizing this webinar for the opening remarks. So I'll give the floor to Mrs. Josiane Gauthier, Secretary General of SIDSE. Mrs. Gauthier, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. SIDSE's engagement in this important process emerged, as was said earlier, from a process of dialogues, but it began actually in previous COPs. And the last year, we had the African Climate Dialogues, which led to COP27. And it was a very powerful moment of hearing the voices of African leaders and communities affected. And the loss and damage question became paramount in this. And this statement that we're talking about today was produced following a continuation of this listening process of listening and dialogue and raising voices of people with real lived experiences, as we said, of what loss and damage looks like and feels like in real life. And the faith leaders who've signed this statement bring forward a moral argument that is much needed right now, much beyond the technical, beyond the political, or beyond the economic spheres and factors of loss and damage. It's an issue about solidarity and the process of decolonization as well. And for CITSE and our partners, solidarity is a core value and a guiding principle where we recognize the fundamental dignity of every human person and our responsibility towards one another and towards the planet. But decolonization is also a process of unlearning ways of being with each other and with the planet, which are harmful, painful, and are grounded in unjust and unbalanced systems of power. It's a framing that helps us to better understand and feel the pain and the damage already caused, as well as the uneven benefits and suffering that we've seen in the destruction of our planet and of our climate, because some are benefiting. And ahead of COP28, we have a responsibility to raise these voices and stories once again and ensure that they are heard and given the weight that they deserve, and let them affect us to transform us and shift the way we look at climate policy going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I'll give the floor to the Secretary General of Caritas Internationalis, Alistair Dutton, please.
Hello, everyone, and it's good to see so many of you online this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where you are. Cardinal Maffei, it's probably the middle of the night, so particular thanks to you for being with us. Firstly, to say that increasingly from the communities that we all work with, we know that loss and damage is real and present and hurting people already. This is about the effects of climate change that one can no longer adapt to, one can no longer recover from. These are about those losses and damages that cause people to have to do things in fundamentally different ways. And at the most extreme, it causes people to leave their homes and move to other places. Linking with loss and damage, Caritas Internationalis recently published the report I'm holding up, which is about displacement, which is created by climate change. And we know that as the climates become more hostile and erratic, every year, more and more people are starting to give up in the places where they live and accept that they have to move in order to provide for themselves and their families in the long term. So loss and damage is no longer an issue we can quibble about the existence of. It was good to see it come on to the agenda of COP, but now we need to see real progress to secure a loss and damage facility that will actually be acceptable to people who are suffering these losses and damages and allow them to use it to make the regrettable changes in their lives that they now have no choice but to do. Very much welcome the faith leaders coming together around the issue of loss and damage and making the moral case for action. The importance of faith worldwide is unquestionable. The vast majority of people in the world are people of faith, although those of us in the West often seem to forget this. And the faith traditions, all of them agree that we have this responsibility to one another and to our common home. And faith traditions also provide a moral leadership and authority that people look up to, people are thirsty for, and nowhere more so than in the big political debates. Loss and damage is not primarily a technical issue. We can solve the technical problems. It is primarily a moral, social, and political issue. Unless leaders come together with bold ambition and courage to tackle the issues of climate change, and particularly loss and damage, we will get nowhere in Dubai. And that's why the leadership of faith leaders being shown in this way and providing that moral voice and moral demand to world leaders is so important. So I hope as world leaders come together that we will start to see a far-sighted vision of justice, that rather than engaging in mealy-mouthed tiny promises that barely scratch the surface, and rather than getting caught in self-interested struggles of power, we will start to take the protection of our common home seriously at levels that will make a meaningful change and keep us within the limits of 1.5 degrees C, but what that will mean for people who are struggling to have live the lives they have. The Loss and Damage Fund will be absolutely fundamental for the retribution and restoration of people's lives. And we need to continue to emphasize, as people of faith and people who come from the grassroots communities, the solidarity that is essential with climate-affected communities, to put their voices at the heart of loss and damage and a loss and damage fund and ensure that it really serves their interests. So I'd just like to close by pointing then to loss and damage being crucial for the common good. It needs to be put at the center of climate negotiations. And we need to make sure that we achieve adequate redress for loss and damage in order to achieve global justice. We all share a collective responsibility for people and planet and future generations. There aren't two crises, there is one crisis. We have to look after one another and the social dimension, and we have to look after the ecological dimension. And we have to do that with an intergenerational view that really puts people and future people at the heart of everything we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dutton. So both the two Secretary Generals of CITSE, Caritas Internationalis, underlined how this is really a moral issue and how it is very important to give the voice to the people affected by climate change and experiences, loss and damages. And looking at this, I'm very pleased to give the floor to the first panelist who will talk to us about loss and damage from the perspective of the communities at the front line of climate change. It's Sister Mamalifar Poreko, who is the Executive Co-Secretary of the Justice, Peace and Integrity of Creation Commission. It is a joint commission of the Union of Superior General and the International Union of Superior General, which promotes the integration of justice, peace and integrity of creation in the life of mission of their member congregations. So, Sister Mamalifar, the floor is yours. And excuse me, sister, we cannot hear you. I know that you also would like to share a presentation.
Yes, let me just, and then I will share after.
Perfect.
But we go. Okay. There are visible climate change impacts on the most vulnerable across the world. For example, pastoralist communities in Kenya lost all their animals due to drought, severe drought, and some contemplated suicide. Drought also forced a young man from Senegal to undertake a dangerous journey that ended his life in the ocean. We have seen raging wildfires in Canada, US, Australia, Italy, and many other places. The depletion of water by lithium mining displaced an indigenous community in Chile. And there are so many examples that I could give. Nature has been shouting to be heard and action taken for the common good, which is ignored, leading to the cry of the poor. Pope Francis Laudato Deum insists on lack of adequate response to the climate crisis that affects people's lives and essential services such as healthcare, sources of employment, access to resources, and housing. Communities on the front lines know that fossil fuels are not the only culprit for climate change and biodiversity loss. Extractivism and mining is also a big culprit due to chemical use, agricultural land loss, contamination of water, environmental degradation, and health. In demanding urgent action to reduce emissions not to exceed the 1.5 degrees temperature goal and invest in essential adaptation efforts to prevent future harms, we must demand the same of mining activities. The Loss and Damage Fund is to support vulnerable communities to adapt to climate change. COP27 discussed this, did not consider the energy transition that implies mining. The jargons to blind us buy into the idea include green minerals, transitional minerals, critical minerals, green energy, clean energy, green economy, blue economy, all of which are mere greenwashing. The EU and its partners have decided on mining spree in both global north and global south to control the supply chain of minerals due to demand for electric cars. This drive for minerals has led to the designation of some areas as sacrifice zones, many of which are in the global south. An article entitled "Lithium Mining in Africa Revealed Dark Side of Green Energy" states, the new rush for lithium in Africa risks fueling corruption and harming local communities and the environment, investigations have shown. Communities in the global south, for example, Indonesia and DRC, are already experiencing the consequences of the critical minerals extraction for energy transition. I have seen how lithium, called the white gold, needed for electric cars, batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, and energy production is creating food insecurity, health and environmental problems, human rights abuses, corruption, and displacement of local communities. Let us not be deceived by the jargon of clean energy. It presents a false solution to the climate change, to the climate crisis, with a hidden agenda for excessive mining that has severe consequences for the most vulnerable. The clean energy jargon is a mere wrapping paper and not a real solution. We do need clean energy adapted to the local context. There are examples of sustainable energy production in small quantities from organic materials that can be explored and expanded. For example, biogas from animals and human waste and peanut shells. In Paris, the metro's tar cells produce 2,200 watts of clean energy per day with a small movement. When people enter the metro, they pass through the inlet turbines that produce energy. A day of energy collection, a family of 4 can have 9 hours of power supply. According to a Tesla manufacturer, this idea could supply a whole metro line and save 30,000 tons of CO2 per year. Pope Francis in Laudato Si number 70 said, genuine care for our own lives and our relationship with nature is inseparable from fraternity, justice, and faithfulness to others. Therefore, we are each and individually and collectively responsible for the good of our human and nature brothers and sisters. It is in this context that the Loss and Damage Fund must be placed where justice calls on those having the greatest means and the responsibility to take the lead and push forward urgent and genuine solutions that will not cause further harm. These solutions must fit These solutions must fit the local realities and not technocratic solutions imposed on local context. As faith leaders, we must stand with the people in these designated sacrifice zones to resist this new colonial strategy being used once again to control people and resources. Therefore, faith leaders from across the world call on COP28 in Dubai to agree to establish a fit-for-purpose loss and damage fund that truly meets the needs of people at the front lines of the climate emergency. Say no to fossil fuels and a plan for excessive mining and extractivism. Establish good mechanisms of control, revise the agreements regarding who will take care of the funds and the requirement to access those funds. Establish binding sanctions for those countries who will fail to comply with the agreements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Mamalifa, for your comprehensive overview and for your call to find solution which can fit in the local context and also to get mechanism of control and sanctions. And now we are going to hear Mrs. Shaheen Ashraf, who is the head of global advocacy at the Islamic Relief Worldwide. They also issued a statement on loss and damage, and she's going to reflect on a faith leaders' loss and damage based on their own document. So, Mrs. Shaheen, please.
Thank you. And it's deeply humbling to be here in front of you all today. And I stand before you, actually deeply concerned about the state of the world. I've just come back from Geneva and had recently returned from Pakistan. And I've actually seen the devastating impacts on where we are. And as faithful stewards of this earth, it's our duty to address these urgent and critical issues that face our community. So today I speak not only as a Muslim, but as a member of the broader faith community, recognizing the shared responsibility that we all bear in the face of this common crisis. The signs of climate change are evident in the cyclones that ravage communities, the heat waves and the droughts that render the land infertile, and the wildfires that tear through what I believe is God's creation. We're witnessing the warming of the seas, which not only devastate marine life, but also have severe consequences for those who depend on these as part of their livelihoods. So as we gather to address the pressing issue of loss and damage at COP28, it is essential to reflect on the shared moral teachings that underpin our faith, our common commitment to justice, to compassion, and stewardship, and unite in the face of the climate crisis. And again, our shared moral teachings also emphasize justice and compassion for the vulnerable. And in the face of loss and damage, it is crucial to recognize the disproportionate burden borne by the poorest and the most marginalized communities. And in light of our shared theologies, the call for a comprehensive and just loss and damage fund resonates with the teachings of all of our faiths. And it is this collective responsibility that echoes the very principle of what we call in Islam the ummah, or the community. We are one global community responsible for one another and for the well-being of our shared home. And as a people of faith, we must recognize the moral imperative to act. So what does justice demand us to do? It demands us to understand that we have the responsibility, that we must lead the way in finding urgent solutions. The establishment of a comprehensive loss and damage fund is not merely an economic calculation, but it is a moral obligation to address the deep injustices at the heart of the climate crisis. The cries for justice from the most affected communities across the world must be heard and answered. Again, a potentially pivotal moment in the fight against climate change when affluent nations pledged 100 billion, 76 billion, which in the UK currency, in yearly funding by 2020 to help the developing world to deal with the effects of the global climate crisis. And this is the stark reality. 3 years beyond the original deadline, only a small fraction of the promised climate finance has been delivered. With each passing year, countries like Pakistan, where I was in August, those countries most vulnerable to climate change, count the most mounting cost of increasingly frequent and intense floods and tropical storms. No amount of financial aid can bring back what communities worst affected have lost in disasters like the unprecedented floods that hit Pakistan last year. The toll exacted by climate disasters defies monetary valuation. How can money alone begin to compensate those who have suffered the loss of loved ones, the loss of homes, the loss of connections to their communities, the loss of ties to their land, and the loss of their culture? And what meaningful justice can there be for those who have lost their lives in a disaster that would not have happened on such a destructive scale if it were not for the actions of select few major polluters? We cannot speak of climate justice, compensation or no compensation, as long as the industry and governments continue to invest in oil and coal extraction, further damaging the environment and fueling emissions, prioritizing people over profit. And these are some of the critical issues that I would like to address today. One of the things I think that was said before, the speaker before me, she spoke about climate change through policies. And this is the thing, we will be at COP28, but policies and grand declarations, the stark reality is that those measures really do lack substance to affect real change. It is not enough to create an illusion of a commitment. We must ensure that the policies that are put in place are robust, impactful, and effectively executed. Equally troubling is the phenomenon of the diversion of the responsibilities when some entities, be they big corporations or institutions, engage in greenwashing, in which they distract from their own contributions to environmental degradation and loss. This, my dear people of faith, not only perpetuates a cycle of blame, but also hampers our collective ability to address the systemic issues that underpin climate change. And to address this challenge, we must recognize increased transparency, increased accountability, and a genuine commitment to sustainability efforts. It is not enough for policies to look good on paper or for organizations to paint themselves as environmentally conscious without tangible actions to back it up. We need real measurable change. And having said that, loss and damage finance is that, again, it's for the countries that least, who are on the front line of the climate crisis. This is what they deserve. They deserve to be able to have that. The loss and damage fund that we as faith leaders call for at COP28 in Dubai must be fit for purpose, not just in Pakistan, but for everywhere around the world. It must ensure accessibility for communities in need, providing them with the resources required for recovery, allowing them to shape their own destinies. The fund must be comprehensive, addressing both economic and non-economic loss and damages resulting from extreme weather patterns and slow onset disasters. And furthermore, and I'd like to end with this, the fund must operate on the principles of restoration and justice, providing grants and not loans based on the polluter pays principles. It must be representative. It must be governed by an equitable board that upholds human rights and principle of subsidiarity, acting in the common good. As faith leaders from across the world, we urge the leaders here and the leaders that will be at COP28 to listen to the call of justice and establish a loss and damage fund that truly meets the needs of those on the front lines of the climate emergency. Let us please strive for a world where peace, harmony, and solidarity prevail, where we work together to safeguard our common home and protect the most vulnerable among us. And may God guide us in all our efforts and grant us success in the pursuit of a justice and environmental stewardship. Amen.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Ashraf. I retained from your presentation what very important you said at the beginning, that we have people from all faiths. We have the shared responsibility as we are one, all communities caring to one another. During your presentation, you also said that communities, nobody can give back to the communities what they have lost. And what they have lost is not only an economic loss. Non-economic loss and damage is one of the matter that Caritas Internationalis is really focusing on, especially in the view of the upcoming COP28. And in the following days, we will present a report on non-economic loss and damage. The foreword of this report is authored by Cardinal Soane Patita Mafi, who is the Bishop of Tonga and also the President of Caritas Oceania. And I'm now very pleased to give him the floor for some reflection on loss and damage, especially from the perspective of the experience of the Pacific. Your Eminence, please.
Thank you, Mother. My experiences with the Caritas Oceania for the last 15 years has allowed me to see and feel the sufferings of people across our region due to climate change. And having grown a lot in learning from these experiences and in the understanding of my role as pastor, I do feel the call to challenge the real causes underlying these hardships and to show solidarity with our people and to help build a just world where everyone can thrive. I'd just like to pick 3 points that significantly touching to me as by way of demonstration. It is when my small island nation of Tonga was devastated and affected badly by a volcanic explosion in January of 2022. I may sum up the devastation and destructive impact in just 2 words: a great loss and damage, as our subject theme says. My first point, Pope Francis almost immediately sent a message of moral support and solidarity after the explosion in Tonga. And this gesture of a great pastor and spiritual father uplifted my soul and the lives of our people with his message that thrilled right into the depths of our hearts and our lives. It kept us united and resilient and hopeful. For despite of the loss and damages of our homes and temporal goods, our inner souls were somehow being restored to their proper dignities and sacredness. Second point, following the impact of the volcanic eruption, myself as well as other fellow faith leaders were on air taking turn in the only one radio station that survived and giving messages of ethical support throughout the entire nation at that devastating time. And from this on air on that evening of the incident, it is from which our people had counted these as consoling and even healing messages during a time of such disaster and emotional darkness. In other words, with the ethical lens of God's word and faith teachings, our people were able to find new perspective and meaning to their suffering. My little third point from that incident in Tonga. It was my own personal encounter with people who were suffering and struggling in their traumatic experiences. Many were displaced from their places of origins as they were moved to safer grounds. Sacred places like churches and cemeteries were ruined. Bones and skeletons of the deceased of loved ones were washed away and disappeared for good. I do remember one young mother cried and cried, and she said to me, "Bishop, it's so sad enough to know that some financial help can rebuild my house, but no money can put a value to the loss of these sacred belongings. These are parts of my being, my life, my heritage, my own culture of who I am." Finally, when I was asked by fellow Caritas co-workers and colleagues to write and afterward do a report entitled "Addressing Non-Economic Loss and Damage, a Case for Action," I wrote in these words, and I like to finish this little 5-minute sharing with, and I quote in my presentation of the afterword of the report: "Non-economic losses and damages get to the heart of our common humanity, to the heart of our reason for being, to the heart of what we are called to do as a human family. Ultimately, this issue brings to the heart of the United Nations the existential questions of what has value to us as a global community. For too long, our shared political and economic system has privileged only those things that can be quantified in monetary terms as having value. Yet across the global community, we know that much of what is important cannot ever be readily quantified. To assign them a monetary value is to strip them of what makes them precious and beautiful. An effective global response to climate change certainly demands and requires that we do all that we can to prevent all loss and damage, both economic and non-economic, by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to climate change impact. But it also requires that we provide assistance and comfort those people already suffering from the irrevocable and invaluable losses and damages. They need to feel the embrace of the global family in this time of extreme crisis, so that they feel supported and that the rest of the globe acknowledges the obligations arising out of a collective sense of justice and morality. End of quote. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Eminence. His Eminence is, of course, one of the faith leaders who signed our statement, and thank you for sharing with us also the cry of this woman and your community. As we know, those who have done the least to cause climate change are those also who are suffering the most, and Oceania is one example of that. Before giving the floor to our last panelist today, I just would like to remind you that if you have any questions for the panelists, you can share it to the chat box. And now I will invite to speak Mrs. Tasneem Essop, Executive Director of Climate Action Network International. She will share with us some remarks on the importance of the faith voice in influencing climate politics. So, Mrs. Essop, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And let me start out by thanking the organizers for inviting me into this very important webinar and to address, in fact, the critical contribution that the faith community is making towards not only signaling the importance of addressing a climate crisis, but also presenting, very importantly, the kinds of solutions we would need as a global community to address that crisis from the perspective of justice and morality. I was privileged enough to be part of the dialogue process that resulted in the statement in June. And so very happy to be back here and talking about what the challenges are and how the statement contributes to the overall global community's response to this. Certainly, this has been a year of devastating impacts and impacts being felt across the globe. No region left untouched by the increasing and more frequent experiences of the climate impact. So as our speakers said already, we've had flooding in many places, Libya, following on a devastating experience of the floods in Pakistan, at that kind of scale of devastation. We witnessed what happened in Libya, but Greece, Spain, other countries also not left untouched by the frequent flooding. And up to now, in the week that passed, in the month that passed as well, the kinds of flooding that we're witnessing, heat waves increasing, fires increasing, extreme weather events like the hurricanes that's being experienced in many regions of vulnerable regions of the world. So certainly building of 2022, 2023 just exceeds all records when it comes to not only the heating of our planet, but certainly already the devastation of its impacts. Now, we're all experiencing this. This is not theoretical when we talk about the dangers of climate change. It's not in the distant future. We're experiencing it and we've heard the stories being told. But at the same time, we're also getting ready to go into a COP where political leaders have to make really important decisions. But all the reports that have come out in recent times, whether it is the UNEP emissions gap report, the production gap report, the adaptation gap report, all of this, including the IPCC science, the assessment report 6, essentially sends us an alarming message that we are, in fact, going in the wrong direction to address this climate crisis. So we're feeling the crisis. And again, it's those who are most vulnerable, those already living in vulnerabilities related to poverty, inequality, marginalization, oppression, conflict, etc., bearing the worst burdens of this impact, who are least responsible, and then our leaders are taking us in the wrong direction. And so I'd also like to support the call that at the center of any discussion about loss and damage, any discussion about loss and damage fund, has to be the issue of addressing justice and morality. And justice does not always, as one of the speakers indicated, come through money. And it has to be, of course, there has to be reparations, there has to be compensation. But justice also comes with the humility to accept responsibility for what people are bearing now. And unfortunately, that morality of accepting responsibility, especially by those who are historically responsible for this crisis, whether they're countries, whether they're companies, that humility, that morality is far from being visible. and the solidarity that comes with that also. And I will speak about that as well. Now, when we collectively, and again, the faith community really stood side by side with, large parts of the movement in big coalitions, when we stood together to work to get the agreement to establish a fund after more than 30 years of struggling for it at COP27, it was through our unity, our sense of justice, our power collectively that we managed to get the agreement for the fund at COP27. And at COP28, we need to get a fund that will work now. The fund must be operating and the fund must have funds. And the interesting challenge in these discussions, the negotiations, unfortunately, has led us to a situation where rich nations, again, push to have this fund that is so critical, a mechanism to address justice, to be housed in the World Bank. A World Bank, an institution that does not have a very good historical or current track record of really putting the lives of poor people at the center of its decision-making. So we have a situation where we're going to have a fund. It is a temporary housing in the World Bank for about 4 years. Developing countries try to get strong conditions for that. But all of the principles you've spoken about in your statement about this fund and what it needs to do, about direct access, about transparency and accountability, we cannot take for granted. And we will have to be vigilant in terms of how this fund is going to be established and governed and run in a World Bank scenario. So certainly we go into this COP with a challenge. Secondly, we need to have the funds flow. So that is another area where there's not clarity yet about which of the rich nations are actually going to contribute and capitalize the fund. What about getting polluters to pay, and the fossil fuel industry as an example? So certainly there's a lot that we need to work together around, faith communities with wider civil society, and we look forward to it. One of the things, and it's been raised by all speakers, when we took up the loss and damage fight, we were understanding that we're in a crisis and people were already suffering. It's not theoretical. And that we needed to address the loss and damage issue very strongly and get funds mobilized. So we were dealing with the consequences of a climate crisis. And this year, we are really going to have to address the causes of the climate crisis. And so the wider movement, the climate movement, will be going to this COP to really fight for the phasing out, the just and equitable phasing out of fossil fuels. We can no longer come to COP after COP after COP and not actually deal with the big elephant in the room. And so we need to recognize, and all the science tells us, that the main drivers of this crisis is fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, and that we really need to have no new investment and production in fossil fuels, and we need to have a phase out of fossil fuels while we're phasing in renewables, while we address energy efficiency, but also clearly you can't only have renewable energy and not phase out fossil fuel, because the trends are showing that that is still, a growing and accelerated investment and production of fossil fuels. So certainly we go into this COP understanding that we have to come out with an agreement that addresses the causes of the climate crisis. We have to get a fund that addresses the consequences of the climate crisis, and to achieve at least some measure of justice through such a fund. And thirdly, we have to address the issue of adaptation, because all of these, if we don't have enough agreements and actions to bring down emissions, and we don't have enough funding to support the building of resilience through adaptation, then there's a direct relationship to how devastating the impacts will be, how massive we will have losses and damages. So we really have to look at all of these together. And in the end, even though we know and recognize that funding does not address non-economic losses, but we do need, especially those who are living in vulnerable countries and communities, would need to have the kind of levels of funding that can protect them and secure them as best as possible. So certainly we look forward to standing shoulder to shoulder with the faith community in working to achieve these outcomes that need to fundamentally address injustice. I want to end off by signaling in this, forefronting of justice, of solidarity, that we go into a COP as well, and it will be challenging. We go into a COP where not only is the fossil fuel industry going to be in its largest numbers, but 2,500 kilometers away from where the COP is being held, there's an unfolding genocide. And we as the climate movement, we have always said there can be no climate justice without human rights. And so certainly we go into a challenging COP that really has to address justice front and center. Climate justice is not disconnected from other justice. So certainly this is going to be a challenging COP. As I said, we are a global community and we stand in solidarity with the faith community, and we will work together at the COP. And I look forward to doing that as the executive director of a very, very large climate network. Thank you very much, and congratulations for the work that you've done. Much appreciation, and certainly the statement has had and will have a huge impact in our overall and collective fights at the COP. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Absop. So in your presentation, you underlined you talk about climate justice and how to ensure prompt assistance with urgent measure to be taken. While we are still collecting some questions from the audience, I would like to ask the panelists for a very quick round based on the 5 principles underlined in our statement, which are accessibility, comprehensiveness, restorativeness, representativeness, efficiency, and effectiveness. Which one of these principles would you like to emphasize on as a crucial for the Loss and Damage Fund commitment to climate justice and prompt assistance? So I will like to ask, following the order of our agenda, to Sister Mamalifa Poreko for a very quick comment on that.
Sorry, could you repeat the...
Sure. On which one of the 5 principles underlined in the faith statement you think it will be better to emphasize as crucial for the Loss and Damage Fund commitment to climate justice and giving people prompt assistance?
Sorry, can you repeat the 5? They escaped me.
Yes, we were talking about accessibility, comprehensiveness, restorativeness, representativeness, efficiency, and effectiveness, or any other.
I think for me, what is important is effectiveness, in the sense that, as one of the speakers mentioned, you can have a policy, or you can make a decision and that decision remains on paper, because action needs to be taken, and in a way that that action can be visible, can bring about transformation. And for me, that is where I see the effectiveness comes. I remember one of the speakers, the last one I think, mentioned that they have been talking about this what is it called, damage fund for in so many COPs, and up to today there is no visible action to show that it is taken seriously. So for me, I think things need to be effective, not just we say things because we have to say them and we write them black on white and they remain there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Mamalifer. So, Mrs. Ashraf, I'll ask you the same question to you.
Thank you, and thank you for asking the question. I think in terms of important, it's kind of challenging to prioritize one over the other, as they're all quite interconnected. For example, if you're talking about an accessible fund might not be effective because it lacks representation, and it maybe lacks restorative measures. Similarly, a comprehensive fund might not achieve its goals if it's not efficiently and effectively managed. So if I build on the moral case, I would say it's more appropriate to view these principles as a holistic framework that collectively contribute to what we've all said, which is a just and ethical response to the global challenges that we face, coming and anchored into that moral perspective. So for me, the key is to strike a balance that addresses the immediate needs of affected communities, whilst also promoting sustainability, equity, and accountability in the long term. I'm sorry I haven't answered the question exactly, but I know there's such an interconnectedness, and I feel very, very strongly about this statement, so I can't choose one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Your Eminence, Cardinal Mafi, so there is one particular principle you would like to underline based on our statement.
Yeah, thank you. I sort of lean towards the collective, the whole 5 points, interconnected, as the last speaker mentioned. But in particular, I would perhaps emphasize more the fund must be representative in terms of these, as it leans in a particular sense, perhaps to the underpinning moral, human rights, principles, subsidiarity, and all this, because that will be, as we listen to the last speaker of the first round, really inspiringly emphasize that moral, ethical, justice side of, because I think this is the underpinning and actually what's unique for us as church, well, as we basically stand in that unique thrust of a divine power, actually. So to emphasize that the representative aspect of those points, as mentioned already by the speakers, we have to, in consideration of the other points, make our point that uniquely belong to us as faith people. The world and leaders need to even have this magical or miraculous power of our faith, which has to be hammered home constantly and strongly evermore of policy makers, the so-called conversion that Pope Francis had challenged even church leaders and leaders around the world and policy makers. We need to have that shift in our mindset and heart, which is conversion. That is what uniquely the message of faith-based leaders. But therefore, we need to convert first ourselves. and perhaps the miracle touch from the churches, from faith-based communities, will hopefully finally convince those in leaders and policymakers.
Thank you, Your Eminence. And last but not least, Mrs. Hassop, do you want to comment on the question? You want to answer the question?
Well, just maybe to add, I mean, I agree with Shaheen. You can't really separate any of them, but I would say a precondition to ensuring, effectiveness, accessibility, justice, etc., would be representativity. Who governs these funds? Who sits in these rooms really would determine whether or not these funds are going to serve the purpose of ensuring justice. And so certainly, we've had many examples of where if it's not representative, the fund, we've had examples of that. If it's not representative, the funds don't really serve the purpose, are not accessed by those it's meant to serve, etc. And so having a representativity that is driven by a rights-based approach, certainly I think would be a precondition to ensure the other priorities in terms of the principles you've listed. Thank you.
Thank you. So we received one question from Angsala Marma from the indigenous youth community from Bangladesh and Chittagong Hill. So he or she is saying that they have more than 13 ethnic minority community people and would like to know to empowering how they can access fund to empowering youth. I'm not sure that if anybody from the panelists, we would like to share the question. We would like to answer the question, sorry. Please, Mrs. Tasneem.
Yeah. So maybe just to clarify, the fund has not been established yet. And very much the challenge about how would young people, minority communities, indigenous communities, etc., be able to access the fund, those rules are being determined now while the fund is being established. So your voice will be critical in these discussions. Who gets access? How can the most vulnerable get access? All of those as part of the decision-making to operationalize this fund, to set up the fund and get it up and running, that's still being discussed. So, yeah, just to clarify, the fund hasn't been set up. There's no money in the fund. All of those are still things we need to collectively make sure happens, and that decision makers make the right decisions and also put money in the fund.
Thank you. I suppose he or she was asking for any kind of fund, but it is very important to stress how it's important to have this. It is crucial to have this fund. Another question from Dr. Benedict Rosario. So he's asking that, so the Holy Father will be in Dubai to attend COP28. He's asking whether he's right. Yes, you're right, Dr. Alo. And will be there any other faith leader, important faith leader in Dubai? And he's asking whether there will be a joint statement by the head of the different faiths. I don't think we already have an answer on that, but maybe if some of the panelists would like to comment on the importance of the Holy Father attendance at the COP28. Your Eminence, I think I will ask you to answer for the first one. So how is important that Pope Francis is attending this COP, especially on what is said about the different COP and the history of the COP in the Laudate Deum?
Thank you, Mother. I thought you and Alistair there are closer to the Pope there. You might have the better answer than me from this remote Tonga Island. Anyway, yeah, I look at the presence of the Pope as something extra unique in its thrust in solidarity with other church leaders, and especially for his encyclical that already published some years back, Laudato Si, and the one he just published, Laudato Deum. You know, so many in the world have read those profound documents specifically onto these climate change issues and each other aspects that are related to it, even the moral side of it. So his very presence there physically would hopefully would be like the epics in a way, if you like, where other church leaders would be in this. And I think it will be very special to him, to the pontificate himself, as his age and coming to his final years, to count it as the climax of his pontificate. So no other popes before, touch on the climate, environment, and so forth in a very theological and even concrete and easily understood and related and referred to by ordinary people, especially as the whole globe experienced and impacted by this. So what I'm saying, his presence there would be, and it would be perhaps very nice, as Dr. Alon mentioned, the church leader, other faith leaders will perhaps with Pope Francis, and I'm sure other faiths also had come up with documents that read by the entire world. So their very presence physically appearing there, it's like a powerful symbolic gesture, voice to the whole nature of COP28. So we need to pray, and I think that's my last point. We will never underestimate the power of prayer, as I said, in a unique way. And every faith-based community have their own experiences of this power. No other parts of the world can give. It's through us, our faith. So it's good to be the Pope be present there. I don't know about the other church leaders. That's all I can say now, Martha. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Is there any other one who would like to comment on this point?
Yes, I would like to say that I know that Unite Faith for Earth, there will be faith group present at the COP. And I read something, I'm not sure if I remember well what I'm going to say. I don't know exactly that is what I've read. But I think Pope Francis they will be there when Pope Francis will be there. And if I remember well, that they say he will speak when they are there. And I believe that they have a message that they would like to give to the Pope President. And for me, I will say that the presence of Pope Francis at COP is historic, in the sense that, as a Bishop has already said, it will be the first time that we'll have the Pope being there. And I think one significant point is that the Vatican is now a signatory at the, at the UN. And for me, this is something that is very important. And the Vatican is no longer an observer, it's a member. And this is where I find it significant that Pope Francis is going to attend COP as a as a member of the State of the UN, and also to bring the voices. I'm sure he's going there, he's carrying all the voices of the vulnerable people he has been speaking for. And his presence there is also the presence of the vulnerable people that he has been speaking for and with. So for me, I think it's encouraging, and I'm sure his presence will bring something unique that would have been missed if he was not present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Mamalifer. So I'll give the floor to Caritas International Secretary General Alistair Dutton.
I think on the significance of Pope Francis being there, Pope Francis commands respect and authority with all he meets and wherever he goes. Working with leaders of other faiths is a very high priority to him, and we've seen him do that in many different settings. And so I think he will be wanting to galvanize the moral authority of all the faiths when they come together. And it is quite clear what his message will be. I think we live in an era of politics where in which, whereas before politicians tried to lead political thought, we now live in an era of focus groups and populism where they reflect what the communities are just saying back to them. And I think Pope Francis has no time for that. And I think there will be a moral authority that he will bring and a very clear message. We know how well received Laudato Si was in the run-up to the COP in Paris, and political leaders all the way around the world welcomed Laudato Si and the moral voice that it had, and welcomed it in the chamber as something that guided their thinking and their commitments. Pope Francis has just issued a follow-up to Laudato Si called Laudato Deum, and his frustration with the global inaction on climate justice is palpable. His message to the world in Laudato Si is, this is a massive problem, we have to do something about it. His message now is, this is a world global problem and you are doing far from enough. You are pretty much doing nothing about this. We've just had the latest report that says we're on track, not for a 1.5 degree world, but a 3 degree world. And that will be catastrophic for the poorest and most vulnerable, who are at the very heart of Pope Francis's thinking about the world and global justice. So I think, and I hope, he will galvanize the religions to come together, to speak from positions of faith with moral authority directly to global leaders, and to instill in them a sense of urgency that the problem now requires. Thank you.
Thank you. And Pope Francis will also inaugurate the Faith Pavilion, where on the 1st of December, we are going to host this handing over event in which we will give the statement to the COP28 presidencies. So I think that Mrs. Ashraf has something to add. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and I echo the comments that were made just before me. And I think this is the thing, because with Pope Francis, he transcends religious boundaries. He unites hearts and minds in a common cause. And I think coming back to what when Pope Francis spoke and echoed the Laudato Si through the haloed halls of the Vatican, that resonated not just through those haloed halls within the Vatican, but it actually resonated across the globe. His Holiness called for a moral awakening. He urged communities to recognize the interconnectedness of all life and duty to care for the common home. And for me, Pope Francis, as a Muslim, he drew upon the rich tapestry of Catholic teaching, which emphasized the intrinsic value of every creature and the moral imperative to protect the environment. And for me, that environmental stewardship is not just confined in the Vatican. In the Islamic world, leaders and scholars also raising their voices alongside His Holiness in harmony with the teachings of the Quran. And the concept of Khalifa or stewardship is deeply rooted in Islamic tradition. So Muslims are called upon to be custodians on the earth. So for me, the connection between spiritual leadership and climate change is profound. It extends beyond the pulpit or the minbar. It reaches into the hearts and the minds of believers and non-believers alike. And it ignites that very sense of purpose, a recognition that our actions today have consequences for tomorrow, and that well-being of the planet is intricately linked to our spiritual moral compass. So for me, the fact that Pope Francis will be there alongside Muslim leaders, for me, during this ecological crisis, shows a moral challenge of where we are as humanity, and one that we should all embrace, that actually the values that unite us, working hand in hand, and to ensure that our precious earth is there for generations to come. And this is what we are as communities of faith and none. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is very important to be underlined. And unfortunately, we are running out of time. I saw that there are still a couple of questions in the chat, but we will close for today. And so this is a moral case for action, and we can all contribute. And so we invite all of you once again, if you would like to sign the statement and to support the statement, is still available on the website of Caritas Internationalis Kiev, SITSE and Laudato Si movement. I'll thank all the panelists, all the speakers today, and all the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.